Welcome to a live broadcast of the debate between the candidates who want to become the next mayor of Seattle. Tonight's debate comes to you from the studios of KCTS Channel 9 in Seattle, with a special thanks to the Seattle City Club's Washington State Debate Coalition in partnership with TVW, the statewide public affairs network, and KCTS 9 Crosscut. We also want to acknowledge the generous support of our many media partners. And our sponsors, including AARP of Seattle, Salesforce, and Tableau.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Essex Porter from KIRO 7 News. I'll be your moderator for this evening's mayoral debate, and it is quite an honor. An honor also to be joined by three distinguished reporters: Hana Kim from Fox 13 News, Hanna Scott with KIRO Radio, and David Kroman with Crosscut. We'll ask the two candidates for mayor, Lorena González and Bruce Harrell, questions about public safety and public health. As you watch the debate, we invite you to join the conversation on social media. Just use the hashtag you see on your screen, WAElects. Now, the rules are simple. Each candidate will get 1 minute to answer a question with a follow-up discussion led by the questioner. But first, each candidate will get 90 seconds to introduce themselves, talk about their vision for the city's public safety and health, and we're also asking them to share just a little something about themselves that most of us don't know. The order was determined by coin flip. Bruce Harrell won the toss and chose to go first in our previous debate, so this week it is Lorena González's turn. And Ms. González, good evening.
Good evening. Well, thank you so much for having us. I am honored to be here with all of you. I am a Latina, as the first Latina elected citywide ever in the history of the city. I am now your candidate to be Seattle's first ever elected woman of color to be your mayor. You know, as somebody who had to leave maternity leave early on to come back and help lead the city's recovery in COVID, I know what it means to get to work quickly and urgently to help lead on the pandemic that is a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. COVID certainly hit us hard here in Seattle, but we got to work quickly to give millions of dollars of direct relief to small businesses, to families, and to our small businesses across the city. In this race, I believe I am the public safety candidate for all people in this city. I have worked on gun safety laws. I have increased services to those who are suffering from gender-based violence. I have passed historic legislation to hold our police officers accountable. And my vision for this city is to create a safe and healthy city for all of our residents. And while hiring more police officers is an option, it will not generate true equitable community safety for everyone in our community. And in my last few seconds, something people might not know about me is I really don't like raw onions.
Okay. Mr. Harrell, your opening statement.
Thank you very much. It's really my honor to be here. I will tell you that this journey to being the next mayor hopefully has been an exciting one, because I think that I've been talking to everyone about new leadership. We find that unifying Seattle around public safety, making sure everyone gets 7-minute response times, has a feeling of being safe, being able to just enjoy a quality of life, that this is resonating. They also want police reform, and they know my background in police reform. We've been warmly received by almost every neighborhood when I go out to Northgate or Ballard or Columbia City or the Central District, just shaking hands and talking to people. We have a very specific plan. We are talking about increasing our investments in public safety, but not a militarized unit. We're talking about building some new kinds of public safety officers, recruiting for communities who want to protect themselves as well. But make no mistake about it, I'm not defunding the police, as my opponent has clearly made it a purpose-driven part to defund the police, particularly when we know that 90% of the costs are personnel related, that we need effective police departments. So I look forward to these questions, and thank you all for getting us ready. This is going to be a lot of fun, and I look forward to it.
All right. Well, let's get started with that controversial ad that folks were seeing a few days ago. And you've denounced that ad, Mr. Harrell, as racist. In 2017, however, the ad does bring up something that you said you didn't have to justify not calling for Ed Murray to resign over numerous child sexual assault allegations. So if you're elected mayor, how can police officers be expected to treat sexual assault survivors with respect and compassion, seeing the example that you set years ago?
Yeah, so let me make it crystal clear that I support survivors and victims. That in my defense of the process by which we reach truth, many of you know the Emmett Till story and why we have to try to respect the process by which investigations would go. I said the same thing that Councilmember Sally Clark and Councilmember Juarez said, who was a survivor herself. That let's not thwart that process, but I stand with survivors. And what we saw during this last week, perhaps in a Hail Mary chance to be the next mayor, a very racist ad, but what we saw that was more important and more inspirational is we saw thousands of people come up and say to the González campaign, stop that. That is divisive. That is hurtful. That brings upon imagery of people of color that we do not want in Seattle. So I was very happy to see thousands of people react within 24 hours of what we saw. So I will not be a tone-deaf mayor. If I mess up, I will say I messed up. I reserve the right because I am human. But I will tell that the survivors and the victims, and we had a person at our press conference say that the work that I've done for survivors proudly, and I want to thank those people who came forward to defend my record.
Okay. Ms. Gonzalez, as you answer that question and respond to that, let me put another facet of the question to you. If you weren't sensitive to the racial stereotypes that ad evoked, how can you as mayor expect police officers to be sensitive to the possible racial bias in their work?
Yeah, listen, I want to start off by acknowledging that as a woman of color myself, as somebody who identifies as Mexican American, I have also been subjected to discrimination and oppression in our community, and I have apologized and will continue to apologize to members of our communities of color for missing the mark. And that's exactly why we took down the ad. And the reality is that does show that I am a reflective individual, that I listen, and that I'm willing to learn. And the fact remains in this instance, however, that my opponent did in fact work to shield Ed Murray from any kind of consequence, political or otherwise, as a result of 5 credible accusations of child sex abuse. And to this day, even on this stage, he has not meaningfully apologized to the thousands of sexual assault survivors, BIPOC and otherwise, who are still waiting to hear if my opponent has learned his lesson.
Let me also ask, you say you are sorry for the way the ad was done. Do you agree that the ad was racist?
I have apologized for the harm that the ad has caused. And I have heard from BIPOC survivors specifically about the need to center BIPOC voices. And I apologize for the harm that was caused as a result of that ad. That's exactly why I listened and we took down the ad.
Do you want to be more specific about whether you feel the ad was racist?
I think I'm acknowledging that there was harm caused by the ad specifically to communities of color. And in those conversations that I had with those individuals, it became clear to me that the ad was no longer productive because of the harm that it was causing, and it was resulting in doing the last thing I wanted to do, which was create harm within our communities of color and also creating silence amongst our BIPOC survivors. I recognize that was a missed opportunity, and I am deeply sorry for that.
Mr. Harrell, your final thoughts on this?
First of all, I never defended Ed Murray. I was lied to by Ed Murray, but I never defended him. But let me quote KSEN, which is the King County Equity Now, an organization the city has invested millions in to fight racism and to fight for social justice. I'll quote their evaluation of my opponent. Lorena grandstands, has a history of anti-black racism, and is untrusted in community. Now, this is coming from an organization that does work with thousands. Well, I believe the community has said this, and I will also say that she has not apologized. She has not apologized, and in fact, A mailer went out with a black and white picture of me standing next to a rape victim that went out even after she, quote unquote, took the ad down. In fact, as of noon today, the ad was still running on her social media, and I've had reports of that. So the African American community and other communities all across the racial spectrum have said it was racist, number one, and number two, it was not an apology. And
Mr. Harrell, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off here
okay.
so we can move on.
But the community has spoken, and that's the kind of unity we'll want to see. That's why we were partly in the predicament we have, is because people are not taking ownership.
Our next question comes from Hanna Scott.
And thank you, Essex. Candidate Gonzalez, we'll start with you on this question. SPD is down 300 officers or so since 2020. Chief Diaz has said he would like to have about 1,400 officers. As has been mentioned last year during the protests following the murder of George Floyd, you came out and publicly supported defunding police by 50%. Do you still hold that position, and what size of a police force do you think Seattle should have?
I still think it's important for the city in this historic moment to continue to evaluate how we can invest in community-based safety and non-law enforcement systems, and what kinds of body of work need to go away from the police department to other systems that are more capable of dealing with those issues. That is an important value that I continue to hold. It's one that I held last summer as well. And I'm going to keep talking about how we can continue to not just simply reform a police department or find a new officer, but how we are going to actually transform public safety in a way that produces true, equitable community safety throughout the city. Now, I have supported and will continue to support fully funding the hiring plans proposed, but the hard work of evaluating what the right size is about outcomes, and the outcomes for me is about making sure that our children come home at night and don't suffer police violence.
And we're out of time for that part of the answer. I do want to follow up, though, with you really quick. The question I get most often in reporting on this reimagining of public safety and that entire discussion is, what does that look like? Where is that public safety for those parts of the Seattle community that don't feel like they are being protected right now because they don't have officers to respond to their calls?
There are also a number of people in our community who feel that they're over-policed, especially within our communities of color. And I've also heard a lot from them about how they want responsible public safety services that aren't going to result in bodily harm or death to them. And what they want is a police department that has less bias. They want a demilitarized police department. We want to hold bad cops accountable, and we want to create the highest accountability standards possible and hold the line on SPOG so that we can truly achieve reform.
Thank you. Candidate Harrell, starting at the beginning of that question for you, what size do you think the Seattle Police Department should be, and what formula would you use to come up with that?
So in terms of the traditional number of police officers, that is always one of the metrics that we use, around 1,550, about 1,550 authorized positions. When I was public safety chair for 4 years, right before my opponent, we had 1,550. We had authorized positions, we had 1,432 filled. Under her chair, she became the chair of public safety after I did. We lost 143 officers. That would be 40 officers per precinct. And this has a real effect on our ability to respond to crimes in progress, 7-minute response times. My opponent has reviewed many budgets, perhaps 5, and so I think that they want a mayor just with straight talk. Now, we will reimagine the police department. We will recruit from communities. We'll have a new kind of police officer, one that does not carry a gun and badge. We will work with communities and have a citywide summit, going to neighborhoods and ask them, what does public safety look like to you? But make no mistake about it, on her approach, and she is on record saying she's going to defund by 50%. She also went by the Northwest Progressive Institute and said if that were to be achieved, she'd have to lay off every single officer. So you would think a person well-versed in the budget after 5 budget cycles would know with the personnel cost of the department, that was a knee-jerk reaction, and the city deserves more of a thoughtful approach to public safety.
And time, thank you so much. Would you like to have a rebuttal, Candidate Gonzalez?
Thank you so much. Just really quickly, I'll start from the end. So Actually, the words that I said that would have to lay off every person was actually what I said in response to a proposal from a different colleague who was bringing forward a 50% reduction. Those are the words I said in support of my vote no on that particular measure. Now, my opponent wants us to believe that the only issue at the Seattle Police Department is staffing, is hiring. But let's be real, there are deep-seated cultural issues at SPD, from having the largest contingent of folks at the insurrection, 2 officers got fired in that, and from refusing to comply with our vaccine mandate. These are deep-seated problems that the next mayor must understand, appreciate, and get to work immediately.
A final opportunity for a rebuttal.
Under her chair for the 4 years, crime went up 22%. We have to understand that. We had the worst homicide rate we had in 26 years, and they are still talking and perpetuating the narrative, let's defund the police by 50%. I will reimagine the police department with this city, with communities, but I believe the city wants a mayor who has a thoughtful, strategic approach about building community policing, but making sure every neighborhood is safe, regardless as to where the neighborhood is in this city. All neighborhoods are safe, so we're going to work with community to build the right police department, and we're going to reimagine together.
Thank you to both of you. The next question will come from David Kroman from Crosscut.
Thank you. Since 2012, Seattle has spent over $100 million towards police reform as part of the federally mandated consent decree. In the wake of last year's protests, do you believe that money was well spent and that officers are today being held properly accountable for their actions? I'll start with you, candidate Harrell.
Well, I do not think money has been spent nearly as effectively or efficiently as it should be. And under our approach, with all major investments, whether it's public safety, our homelessness strategy, our climate change strategy, we will open up all of the books. We'll allow people to see exactly where their investments are going and what the outcomes are. We will drive. I know this is not a homelessness forum, but I have to hum a few bars of that because that is the number one issue people are talking about. We will show cost per person, cost per unit, where we are now and where we have to get people out of the parks into housing. Our public safety approach will be the exact same way, that we have to show efficiency in government, and we're not doing that. That's why that's why I'm very specific on the numbers. We're even looking at now that even amidst all of this, I know that my opponent is proposing, I think, $4 million of cuts already to SPD during this current budget cycle. So, no, we're not spending our money efficiently or effectively, and under the Harrell administration, we will.
To follow up on that, as you just mentioned, you were the chair of the public safety for much of the period that I just mentioned. So if it was not being spent effectively at the time, do you bear some responsibility for that?
I will bear responsibility if the city council, all 9 of us, could have been more efficient in our budgeting process. The fact of the matter is the mayor has direct oversight over these departments. That's just the fact. The mayor can decide what kind of head counts he or she wants, where they can reorganize and structure the department to be more efficiently. That's a struggle of a council member when sometimes you're not getting all of the information that you need. But at the end of the day, it is the mayor's responsibility. But I'll be the first to say that if I could have been more effective and more efficient in city government when I was on the city council for 12 years, I certainly will bear that responsibility.
Candidate Gonzalez, the same question to you. Was the $100 million spent effectively, and are officers being held properly accountable today under the current systems?
So I think it's interesting that in response to this question, my opponent effectively doesn't want to answer whether or not reform has been working at the city of Seattle in the context of the fact that the Seattle Police Department spent almost an entire month tear gassing hundreds and thousands of people in our city, both ones that were protesting and ones that were just living in Capitol Hill. That elicited 18,000 complaints, including complaints showing officers kneeling on individuals' necks, the very thing that killed George Floyd. So no, we haven't gotten our money's worth. And SPD is no longer just a department we need to reform. We must transform it. In order to do that, the next mayor, again, must know and acknowledge that the reform we have done to date has been important, but has been insufficient to truly keep our community safe.
Thank you. The next question comes from Hana Kim.
All right, thank you, David. So
My topic is about repeat offenders, something that many of us know well in Seattle. A small group of people are behind a lot of the crime. Many times they are cycling in and out of the justice system with no meaningful intervention. This is a problem for Seattle. Again, what is your strategy? And not just ideas here, but strategy and actions that you would take as mayor that you think would move the needle on this issue. Ms. Gonzalez, you have the floor first.
Sure. Well, I think we have to get to the underlying root cause. So long as we bring back the failed policies of the past, which are fundamentally about arresting and incarcerating and perpetuating those criminal convictions, we're going to continue to see the outcomes that you're describing. So really what we need to do with this relatively small universe of individuals who are continuing to be involved with the criminal justice system is really engage in deep case management, connect them with programs like LEAD and other restorative justice harm reduction programs. They're really going to begin to identify their housing needs, their substance use disorder treatment needs, their mental health needs, their housing needs, and begin the process of transferring people from engaging in this negative behavior to being a more positive, productive, stable member of our community. That is going to be a lasting solution. So long as we take an only law enforcement approach, we will continue to see the outcomes you described.
You just brought up LEAD, which is not new. It's a program that's been around for a while. And some might say that it's an old process. We're not seeing that meaningful outcome that Seattleites want to see. Do you have any solutions, actual actionable items that you would take rather than saying we need to do more with LEAD, because it is a program that already exists right now?
LEAD is constantly evolving, and it does have good outcomes. The problem is that we starve it for resources. Every year we have to restore its funding or fight for its funding or spend time talking about how we can get it actually implemented. So the program works. What is not working is continuing to fund programs like that and others that really do go further upstream, address the root causes, and solve for these critical public safety, public health, and mental health issues that continue to be chronic in our community because we continue to chronically underinvest.
Quick follow-up to that, because I want to bring up this case because this is something that a lot of people might remember. Francisco Calderon is a prolific offender who has had 70 plus convictions. His sister did an interview and said he's a harm to himself and to others in the community. She wanted mental health. She wanted help, but he cycled in and out of the system. So why is it that we have so many cases like that right now? Why can't we get a handle on prolific offenders like that?
Because we don't have the mental health services available that are appropriate for people with that high of an acuity need. And that's a fact. We are 46th in the nation in terms of access to mental health for adults like the one you just described. And the next mayor has an opportunity to increase that funding by making sure that we're looking to the wealthiest among us and our most profitable corporations to help us fund mental health services, while we also lobby the federal government and the state government to continue to do more now while we get that new revenue in place.
Thank you. So you said it yourself. You said, let's do some straight talk. So can we get some straight talk on this issue? What needs to be done? I know that in the past, other candidates have said jail and probation is not the answer. So what is the answer?
Well, I do like straight talk. And again, I think you're just hearing, again, just high level sort of rhetoric from my opponent. So let me be very specific on the programs we're going to implement. The first one we have to think about is a person like that that's just a repeat offender. That is not healthy or normal behavior. Clinicians would call it a social deviant, and there's some clinical terms of why a person keeps doing that. That is not how we are raised to be. So the first thing we have to do is there's a curriculum called Increasing Human Effectiveness, one of many curriculums that talks and examines why a person does what they do that's misaligned with normal behavior. So under our program, we will introduce this curriculum, Increasing Human Effectiveness, and we'll have Seattle's Empowerment and Opportunity Program, where we will bring in mentors, people that have come from that kind of life, to show them why you do not need to repeatedly commit crimes. That again, we have to, part of the Harrell administration we talk over and over about, that could have very well been me or my cousin or someone that I grew up with. So we're going to use mentors and clinicians, and we're going to unlock those keys. I'm introducing a Healthy Seattle. And we talk a lot about this on a campaign, which is another means by which we'll make sure everyone has health care. But a component of that will be for them to look at the impediments of who they are and who they can become. Realize this. This is imaging from external sources. This is decades and decades of a systemic pouring of drugs in certain communities. We're talking about 400 years of racial discrimination in some cases, or people coming from a foster system, or someone coming from abusive. It doesn't even know a color. There are impediments to everyone's human experience. And when we talk about race and social justice under the Harrell administration, we're going to talk about those common impediments that every human being has. So these repeat offenders, we have to unlock those doors and see what's going on with that person, because they are harming themselves, and that is not the kind of person that we can nurture and build in Seattle. And that's what our candidacy is all about, building a pathway to self-optimization for every human being.
Real quick, though, why do you think that new program is going to really make a difference?
Well, because it does around the world. It's helped me personally. It's helped everyone that I know, because we go through this curriculum. That when you look at why we act the way we do, we act in alignment with our dominant belief system. And if you believe you are a bad person, if you look in the mirror and think, I was raised this way, all I know how to do is take, that's what I do, you will continue to take. And arresting this person and letting go and arresting them will not work. You have to remove their impediments to self-optimization. That's why it will work. Clinicians will talk about it, criminologists will talk about it, behavioral scientists will talk about it, and we have to incorporate that. Because remember, in the preamble of our charter, we must preserve the safety, health, and welfare of our people. That is our charter purpose. So when you hear defund the police by 50%, you are ignoring our charter purpose. And that's the kind of mayor I hope to be.
Time is up. Thank you. And the next question is from Essex.
And I want to stick with this subject. I do have another subject to talk about, but I want to stick with this subject. I just want to be sure that we're fair to Councilmember Gonzalez. If you want to take maybe 20 seconds and just wrap up that subject before I move on to a different subject with Mr. Harrell.
Sure. I think what I'm hearing are suggestions to address people with some of the most significant mental and behavioral health issues with mentoring and a motivation course or a self-affirmation course. I don't think that mentors are going to be able to adequately address somebody's needs who has schizophrenia, opioid addiction, and housing instability in our city. And really what I'm talking about is getting to the root causes. How do we get people treatment for the conditions that are resulting in them engaging in this behavior? How do we fund that treatment? And how do we address their housing instability to make sure that they can heal, recover, and get out of the cycle of incarceration?
All right, let me stop you there. Our next round of questions begins actually with Mr. Harrell, and this is a question from the public. One of our viewers, one of the voters out there, someone from Hillman City, and this voter from Hillman City is talking about gun violence and telling us that they believe gun violence just hasn't received nearly enough attention from city leadership in the last 5 years. They're asking, what will you do to address this issue, particularly in the South End, where shootings are taking the lives of teenage and young people of color at an alarming rate?
First of all, I agree, and I appreciate the question. The first thing we'll do is have a cabinet-level position to make sure that we are measuring and monitoring the gunshots and the violence in our community. We will invest in community-based organizations. We will work to get the RCW 9.41.290 released, the exemption rule that prohibits cities from really regulating this space. We're one of the few states, by the way, that has this restriction. And with that, we'll make sure that we can take a gun from someone that is intoxicated. We'll restrict the number of guns a person could buy, as an example. We'll increase the background check. We'll introduce technology, an acoustic gunfire locating system to know exactly where gunfire is, as an example, which can pivot around and find exactly where it's occurring, because right now it's complaint-based, and we know the problem with the complaint-based system. And this has worked incredibly effectively in other cities, and so we'll introduce that here as well.
Councilmember Gonzalez?
Yeah, I want to start by centering the lives of those who have been lost to gun violence. All of us know someone who has been lost to gun violence, whether it is a third party or whether it's a result of suicide. And getting guns out of the hands of people who should not have them is critically important for us to do as a city. And while my opponent focuses on building the bureaucracy around how to potentially achieve that, I believe that really, truly addressing gun violence means investing in the mental health and well-being of individuals to prevent preventable suicides, for example. I was the prime sponsor for a gun safety storage law and also increasing penalties for firearms that were not reported lost or stolen. That's a proven strategy to prevent that. Secondly, when I talk to young men, young black men in the South End about what they need to prevent gun violence, they tell me it's mental health to deal with their generational trauma, jobs, and housing that is stable. And those are the things that as mayor, I will seek to invest in to be responsive to the needs and the items being expressed to me that are most deeply needed to get to the root cause.
Mr. Harrell, as you respond to that, would you also respond to the criticism? You mentioned acoustic gunshot locator systems. There's criticism that those systems actually intrude upon communities and lead to more over-policing, more biased policing. Would you address that as well?
Sure. That's just not a true statistic. What it actually does is allow the city to accurately measure where gunfire is. We've seen in complaint-based systems, particularly communities of color, the complaints are not as high. And so what I want the city to do is to force the city to respond to actual gunfire. So it's actually very effective technology, and that's one of the reasons why so many cities have employed it. We do not want over-policed communities. That's why we are creating a new kind of public safety officer, those who are culturally competent, coming from the communities. They will be unarmed, but they will be masters at mediation and de-escalation. They'll be walking around the communities. What my opponent calls more bureaucracy is just baseless. What we need is someone to own the issue. That's why I was rated the highest by the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, because of my gun safety platforms. And so we have to own the issue first.
Let me stop you there. And final rebuttal?
Sure. I mean, I think that in the spirit of being super straight about what this technology is, it is a surveillance technology. It is a technology that is designed to surveil our neighborhoods. And I think that is the wrong approach. Sure, it might help us find a few additional areas where gunshots have been fired, but it will not prevent those gunshots from occurring in the first place. My vision in this area is to prevent the gunshots in the first place. We do that by getting the guns out of our communities and by giving our youth and others in our community the tools they need to survive and be resilient. And that is jobs, housing, and better education so that they don't have to resort to guns as the answer.
Our next question comes from Hanna Scott.
And again, thank you, Essex. Councilmember Gonzalez, candidate Gonzalez, I want to ask you about a letter that was recently signed by more than 150 individuals, small business owners, folks who work in downtown Seattle, sent to the City Council with the Downtown Seattle Association's urgent request to address specifically the criminal shoplifting organizations, rings, not people who shoplift because they're hungry or out of a need, but that are operating fencing operations and shoplifting rings that are making it very difficult for these businesses to succeed and having, in some cases, to hire private security, and that they all collectively felt was a threat to our economic recovery. What specifically would you do to tackle those types of operations?
Well, I think what we do is we work with the city attorney, whoever the next city attorney is going to be, and really start thinking about what are some ways that we can improve the programs related to both identifying those kinds of shoplifting rings that are actually organized crime and not just survival crimes, as you've acknowledged in your question. And we make sure that folks within the police department have the resources they need to be able to do the proper investigation. Now, listen, I get to talk to small business owners all over the city all the time, many of whom I'm lucky enough to call my friends. And I hear the stories from them about how hard it is to do business in this city for a lot of reasons, including the fact that we have saddled them with responsibilities of doing social work as well as protecting their inventory. So I get it. The way we are doing public safety now has failed a lot of us. And that's why my vision is really focused on let's get to the root causes of things, have the short-term solutions in place to address those real criminal elements through our detectives and investigative units, and begin the process of reducing those incidents to begin with.
And just a quick follow-up, is room for one of those solutions to be prosecution?
Well, I don't make choices around prosecution.
Right.
I'm not the prosecutor.
In your mind,
is that a possibility? I do think that if there are large criminal elements that are organized crime and otherwise, I would expect that the city attorney or the King County prosecutor, depending on the crime, would exercise their prosecutorial discretion.
Thank you. Candidate Harrell, same question to you. How would you address those type of criminal operations?
Well, I'm glad that you qualified it as opposed to a person that's just stealing because they're hungry. And you made a clear distinction. And you're talking to a person who's actually defended people from shoplifting. I've had parents come in and say, will you help my child? And so I've had those discussions. But I don't, you want straight talk. You have to you have to enforce the laws. I mean, you shouldn't have to stutter. Those laws are there for a reason. Now, we also want to know why this occurs. These shoplifting rings are very organized often, and so we have to also understand better the culture. I don't know if there's going to be any graffiti questions, but graffiti is driving me crazy in the city. And in addition to using the existing laws that are on the books, we're going to find out why that is occurring. So in all of this antisocial behavior, we have to do a deeper dive in understanding the root causes. These shoplifting rings, I got to tell you, when you start talking about defunding the police, as my opponent has said, they like that because they realize we don't have enough eyes on the ground. We can't respond to crimes in progress.
I need to wrap that up.
I'll wrap it up with that.
Thank you so much. Any rebuttal to those comments, Councilmember Gonzalez?
Sure. I mean, I think my opponent's trying to have it both ways. He wants to say that he's not criminalizing poverty while also saying that all the laws on the book need to be enforced. And the reality is that there are laws on the book that criminalize poverty. So you can't have it both ways. The reality is that there are individuals who are engaging in organized crime. Those individuals should be investigated and should be held to account under those existing laws. And then the last thing I'll just want to say is, listen, my opponent keeps trying to have a conversation about whether or not you agree with a slogan, and I'm focused on outcomes. Let's talk about what the real solutions are to addressing public safety in its broadest terms in our community. It is not just about hiring more guns and badges at the city of Seattle. It is also about setting up alternatives to law enforcement. It's about investing in community-based safety initiatives, and it's about investing in our collective safe and health, not just through policing, but through the things that we know make us a whole, livable, vibrant community.
And final thoughts, Candidate Harrell, on this issue.
It's more than a slogan. It's a recognition when she keeps trying to now probably move out of the narrative of defund the police that she embraced. I understand their pain. They do not want a demilitarized police department. You don't have to tell me growing up in the Central District in the 60s and 70s. I know what that's all about. When we talk about reimagining with a smarter approach, that's what we're talking about. And so I don't struggle because the city knows me. They know that I've spent my life defending people who've needed defense. So I don't have to mince words when I talk about using the laws. We're not decriminalizing poverty at all.
Thank you both. The next question comes from Hana Kim.
So I want to broaden out that shoplifting question to more of overall crime in the downtown core. I heard from a woman the other day. She lives in Pioneer Square, owns a small clothing store near Pike Place Market. She says that she feels unsafe walking to and from work. Also, we know that 500 small businesses in the downtown core, they have permanently closed, much of that because of COVID related, but business owners are saying, look, we cannot get back to the economic revival that we need after the pandemic if we don't put public safety first. So what is your plan? I'm going to start with you, Mr. Harrell. What is your plan for downtown?
Well, first of all, I toured almost every business district, including downtown, with small business owners. And I listen to them, and I know what they want. They want us to loosen up some of the regulatory barriers in terms of the built structure. They want the city to invest, to use our pandemic economic recovery plan as a means to bring in investments and use crime prevention through environmental design. Build the right areas such that people can feel safe. They want us to enforce the laws. They want us to move people from encampments into housing. And they want us to have a sense of urgency. They want access to capital, other things like that, and I talked about that at the previous forum. That's why our Office of Economic Development group is going to be so phenomenal in the work we do to help small businesses. But they want action, and they want change of leadership. That's what they're asking for, and that's why I think we present the strongest case for change in leadership.
Ms. Gonzalez.
Sure. Downtown. Let's just sort of set the scene here. It is the part of the city that has the highest density of service programs. Has about 800 individuals who are hardest to serve the highest needs kind of individuals experiencing homelessness, and we also have a downtown core that is largely still empty. In large part because of COVID, because workers are not coming back into those big, tall office spaces that continue to be underutilized or not used at all. And so for me, my focus is going to be on addressing the public health crisis that is leading to the public safety issues that you describe in your question. There is no doubt that many of the individuals who are currently experiencing homelessness downtown have profound chronic needs that can be met if we invest in high acuity shelters, if we focus our efforts in downtown, and if we quickly begin to connect those individuals to the housing and the mental health services and the substance use disorder treatment that they need to be able to be permanently housed and out of downtown.
One thing I hear a lot from the community, whether people live there or work there, is the current response time. So, for example, in 2019, we had 6-minute response times for priority 1 calls. And when I say priority 1, these are emergency high-level calls. Sometimes this is life and death. So right now, that current response time is more than 10 minutes. Is that acceptable? I'm going to direct that question to you first, since you're on the council, and maybe you could address that. And I want to also have Mr. Harrell answer that as well.
Yeah, the reality is that officers don't just respond to Tier 1 calls, the highest priority calls. They have to respond to all of them, including those that probably don't merit an armed law enforcement response because it's an after the fact and all that needs to happen is a report needs to be taken. In fact, there's a recent report that came out that said that close to 60% of the calls that SPD is currently responding to are for non-violent, non-urgent crimes. So that's where I want to focus. I want to focus on implementing recommendations that we have right now to address that efficiency issue so that we are clearing up the kinds of calls that we're asking officers to take so they have time to respond more quickly to those Tier 1 calls. That is a basic efficiency thing that we can do right away. And those are the kinds of recommendations that I want to put into place to make sure that we are meeting truly meeting the needs of those who need an armed law enforcement response, get one quickly.
Time is up.
Is the 10-minute response time acceptable? No. It's not that hard to say. It is not. We will measure it. When I was public safety chair, we'd go to meetings, monthly meetings, and we'd measure the response times. And we wanted to make sure that there was parity in all neighborhoods, by the way. We want to drive it to a 7-minute response time, and that's when your investment strategy becomes critical, because the police department are saying they need more resources to be able to respond, particularly to 911 calls, crimes in progress, but to all crimes. Now, having said that, again, the rhetoric is, you have to sort of, I guess, listen to it, that my opponent would not even meet with the Downtown Seattle Association, wouldn't even fill out a questionnaire when all they were asking is, well, what is your plan? Realizing that it's small businesses down there. There are neighborhood advocates down there. People are living down there. There's subsidized housing down there. What is your plan? And I think, again, my opponent wouldn't even meet with those folks, that's the mayor's job, is to listen to everybody. And that's what we did. And that's why we know what kind of response times they want. 10 minutes is unacceptable, 7 minutes is.
But Mr. Harrell, how are you going to do that with the climate that is Seattle right now, where you have officers who are leaving the force willingly because of, some of them say, because of the political rhetoric? How do you convince officers to come to a force like Seattle right now and change those response times, as you said?
That is the job of the mayor, to coach, to inspire, to change the narrative, to love this city and love the people in the city. That is my job, is to be the biggest cheerleader, if I can. And we work with the people within the department. We work with communities. We bring them together. Just like the community came together to oppose her racist ad, we build community together. Then when we go to basketball games, we go to football games and soccer games, we get the police officers talking to the community. We start building that together. Now, this is not easy work. That's why we're also going to build at the same time a new kind of officer, a community safety officer type that is certified through our college system that will come with a new skill set. Now, this is going to take a few years to get it completely where we want it to be. But under our leadership, we're going to start with changing the narrative. I believe that the community wants to be protected. And I take that oath of office by those police officers very seriously. That's why I talked about the George Floyd murder, because if a police officer cannot say that that was murder, they don't need to be under the Harrell Police Department. Let's just make that clear.
I want to give you a chance to say a response to that.
Sure. Now, I want to be really clear that SPD is a police department that has been under reform for quite some time. And in spite of that, we see that it has really deep cultural issues. Again, highest number of officers going to the insurrection, 2 of which were ultimately fired, refusing to comply with a vaccine mandate, and tear gassing thousands of people in the city, eliciting 18,000 individual complaints about how they handled a protest in the city. These are real significant issues that have to be addressed by the next mayor, and it has to be done urgently. And the reality is that officers who do not want to be on board with higher accountability, officers who are not willing to be in this moment scrutinized at a historic level, are not going to want to work at the police department. And in fact, some are making choices to leave now precisely because of that, and in other instances because of the vaccine mandate. So we do need to hire additional officers within the budget and make sure we have budget accountability, but those officers need to be on board with the highest accountability standards. We're going to root out bad cops who should not be on the force, and we are going to make sure that we increase the civilianization and the transparency of how we discipline and hold our officers accountable to restore trust between the public and the city.
We're going to have to move on. Thank you. David Kroman, next question.
Thank you. In the wake of the protests last year, there was a lot of talk about police officers' roles, specifically in mental and behavioral health crises. This question comes with some input from a voter in West Seattle who wanted to know what is the ideal role for police officers when it comes to responding to behavioral and mental health crises, and as mayor, how do you make that vision a reality? And we'll start with you, candidate Gonzalez.
Yeah, so the state last year did a lot of reform work. One of the pieces of reform that they passed is to create stricter standards for officers who are dealing with individuals in mental health crisis. Right now, that's creating quite a bit of difficulty in terms of implementation and how officers are actually engaging with those who have behavioral health issues, because if they get it wrong, they will lose their credentials as an officer. So our responsibility at the City of Seattle is to work with our behavioral health service provider community to build the standards within the city that create clear rules and training available to officers who need to respond to those rare instances where they are needed to intervene. And we need to, while we do that, focus on standing up the behavioral health services and centers across the city that we need to make sure that individuals have a place to heal, to calm down, and to get the services they need to no longer be a danger to themselves or others.
And so following up on that, do you think that there will always be a place for for police officers to be involved in crisis response?
I think that in limited number of situations, there will be a need for behavioral health providers to call armed law enforcement to help. Those instances have been described to me by the subject matter experts in this area as individuals who are at risk of creating harm to themselves, real harm, as in death or serious bodily harm to either themselves or to other individuals. So that call needs to be made by those subject matter experts, and we need to be able to have a department that is nimble enough to respond to those rare occasions that they will continue to need to respond to, together with our behavioral health service provider community.
Thank you. Candidate Harrell, what is the ideal role for police when it comes to crisis response?
Well, first of all, if you do your research, there's answers out there. You take in Eugene, Oregon, as an example, they deployed a program called Cahoots. And in this program, they make sure that the gun and badge are not there and the right kind of first responder is there, many mental health counselors. What they were able to do in Eugene, Oregon, were they able to, number one, save $14 million. And they were also able to get the armed police down to around less than 1%. By making sure the right first responder showed up. So what we're going to do, looking at that as a model, we'll make sure the right first responder shows up. That's why we are creating sort of and I got to tell you, that's why I'm most proud of the firefighters endorsement, because they get this stuff. But there's another issue that we're not talking about, and that is, what do they do once they show up? Charlene Lyles as an example. So we're looking on the back end as well, the safe harbor. Right now there are sobriety centers, and we do not want to take a person in a mental health crisis to jail. We don't want to take this person to Harborview because they get released out. We want the individualized case management followed up. So you're going to see under the Harrell administration investments in the safe harbor such that the first responder, who will not be a gun and badge in most cases, will take this person to the safe harbor so we could follow up with the treatment. That's the discussion we have to have. It's not just the first responder. We'll have a new skill set there, but where they take them.
Cahoots has been around for 20 plus years at this point. Why do you think it's just now that we're having this conversation about expanding that?
Well, I think the country woke up after George Floyd. For many of us in our community, that wasn't a new incident, by the way. I could go back many years about situations happening here in Seattle. But the reimagining conversation now are asking everyone, and the young people get this stuff, right? That what will it look like when you reimagine this police department? So we're going to be very aggressive doing that. You're going to see, again, a new skill set showing up at response. I will tell you that the new skill set will not see Charlene Lyles as a threat. They will see her as a person in need of help. This is going to be exciting work, because I will tell you that when we reduce the gun and badge going out, we'll be able to respond to those crisis situations, those violent situations where we do need a gun and badge, but we'll be able to protect all communities, and particularly in these health crises. So we're excited about this work. And quite candidly, that's what the city's asking about. They're not asking about some of these other issues that we're having to deal with during this campaign. That's what they're asking for, and that's what we will deliver on.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Hanna Scott.
And this, I will start with you, candidate Gonzalez. Recently, there was a report that was delivered to the Seattle City Council that looked at traffic stops and how they relate to race. That report found that essentially there were more black drivers being pulled over by SPD who were not carrying guns or doing anything else criminal. There were more of them being pulled over than their white counterparts who did have a gun or were doing some sort of criminal behavior. My question to you is, do you support, based on that data and other parts of the conversation that are going on in this space, doing away with traffic stops or limiting traffic stops by Seattle police?
So just two things really quickly. One is we already have a Cahoots version. We have a Health One mobile and a Triage One to deal with lowest acuity needs. So just wanted to address that particular issue in really quickly. What our challenge at the city is dealing with people with more severe, high needs, acute behavioral health issues. And so that is, I think, a distinction between my response and that of my opponent. As to this particular question, my opponent likes to talk a lot about a bias-free policing ordinance that he passed while on the city council. And we know that report proves it, that we don't have a less biased police department, even in the wake of the passage of that ordinance. So what we need right now is real structural change, not just a statement of legislative intent. And to me, that means removing traffic enforcement from the Seattle Police Department to, for example, the Department of Community Safety and Communications as a way to address that issue.
Okay, I have to wrap that up. Final to you on that question, candidate Harrell.
Again, the current council has dropped the ball on the bias-free policing law. And if you read the article, they're measuring Terry stops, which are, stop and frisk kinds of situations. But on routine traffic stops, I want to know who's being racially profiled. I want to know who gets a warning and who gets a citation. And according to the review, that the city council are not measuring this as required by the law that I passed, required by the law that my opponent supported. So it is clear that I am passionate about making sure that we have equity in policing. It is also clear that I will tell you the number of police officers that make sense and the kind of response times that we want. So once again, they've dropped the ball on a critical ordinance that we will measure, and we'll do a much more effective job under my administration.
Thank you so much, and we are just perfectly out of time. Thank you both very much for your time. Essex?
Thank you all. Really great debate, and we have run out of time, so we want to thank our candidates, Lorena Gonzalez and Bruce Harrell. Thank our panelists, Hana Kim of Fox 13, Hanna Scott of KIRO Radio, David Kroman of Crosscut. Now, everybody, don't forget, Election Day is next Tuesday, November 2nd. You got to have your ballot postmarked by that date or drop it in one of the drop boxes by 8 o'clock next Tuesday night. They shut them precisely 8, so you've got to get there in time to be sure you vote. Thank you all for watching, and have a good night.
Tonight's debate has come to you from the studios of KCTS 9 in Seattle, with a special thanks to the Seattle City Club's Washington State Debate Coalition in partnership with TVW, the statewide public affairs network, and KCTS 9 Crosscut. We also want to acknowledge the generous support of our many media sponsors. And our sponsors, including AARP of Seattle, Salesforce, and Tableau.